Hi, so this is Linda Conley. This is going to be an interview related to the 300th anniversary of the town of Hopkinton, Mass. And there's a project that's going on with that, the Oral History Project, and it's funded by the Historical Commission. I'm here today, February 23rd, 2015, with Irene Timlege, who was born Irene Terry, and we're at the Hopkinton Historical Society, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her memories about growing up and living in the town of Hopkinton. So go for it.
Thanks, Linda. I am a very proud member of the town of Hopkinton. I have wonderful memories, and I'm enjoying my life in this beautiful town now. And I want to start with I guess I'll start with early reflections on growing up. I was born in Hopkinton, 15 Pleasant Street. My father was John Terry, and he was brought up on the farm, and you know it as the Art Center. And he married Lucy Pomeroy, who came from the next town, Ashland.
Pomeroy?
Pomeroy.
And Pomeroy, okay.
Yes, yes. She had, there were 7 sisters, 2 boys, and 7 sisters. Anyway, I want to talk about how life was when I was a child. Everything was delivered. I don't remember going to stores to get things.
Can you just tell us what decade you're referring to?
Yes, I was born in 1930, and we had, the milk was delivered, because we had a dairy farm, but milk was delivered to everyone. Ice was delivered. We got a bakery delivery once or twice a week. And we got our groceries. It's John McDonough, and he would call up and 2 or 3 times a week and take an order from my mother. And if she didn't want anything, she didn't know how to say no, and so she would tell me to answer the phone. And I was so little, I had to push a chair over to reach it and say, my mother wasn't home. I always felt funny saying that. But everything, we didn't go to stores, everything sort of came to us. And my mother was a very hard worker. She loved to clean her house, she loved her home.
And her name, tell us?
Lucy Pomeroy.
Lucy, okay.
Lucy.
Yeah.
And everything was served from the stove, and it was very much portioned out. If you were a man, you got 2 pork chops, and if you were a woman, you got 1, or a girl, boy and a girl were included in that. And she was very frugal, and she just cooked enough so everybody had the proper servings. She never taught me to cook. It's funny, I became a dietitian, but she didn't want anyone in her kitchen but her. And she made everything. I mean, jelly was made. She had an apple tree, and there were so many things that she created. She grew up very poor and was very, very careful of money and food and portioning. And I think even though, you know, the Terry family did pretty well and we were well provided for, she was always, always frugal. And it's good to learn frugality. I appreciated it.
So this is Pleasant Street.
I'm on Pleasant Street.
Yeah.
My mother and dad, yes. And I'll talk more about Dad when I probably move to the farm. So one of the happy things that happened to me is that there was a beautiful farm, which is now known as the Art Center, and I was very close to it. It would take me like 7 minutes to run up there. And when I was about, I don't know, somewhere between 6 and 8, they gave me permission to go, and my uncle, Tom Terry, I should introduce them. The earliest recollection I have is hearing about my grandmother. Well, I knew my grandmother for the first 9 years of my life, but I never knew my grandfather. But they were the Margaret Reardon, Mary Margaret Reardon, and he was a William Terry. and he was picking apples one day, and he was on a ladder, fell, and he had a mole on his face, which got scratched off. And he very slowly died of skin cancer. And my grandmother, these are all stories passed down to me, took wonderful care of him and lost him when she was in her early 40s. And she was left with several children, the oldest being my uncle, which is another William. And he was 18 and he had to take over the farm. And my uncle Tom Terry had to be taken out of school at 16. He was a very brilliant student, but my grandmother needed him to run the farm, and so he came to help out do that. And what I recall about the farm is growing up there, how they taught us self-reliance, and I'm always thankful for that. We participated in so many chores around the farm, and we always had cows and big draft horses, which were kind of scary. Sometimes the cows were. And they always had a pony for us. And the way we learned how to ride, we couldn't ride till we were 7. And then my Uncle Tom would put you on the pony and give him a good crack and make him run around this hayfield that had holes. It was very scary. But somehow children are survivors. I never fell off. And we would train to use the Western saddle during the week, and the English saddle was highly valued, so we could use that on Sunday. So anyway, they had cows, and I would go down with my cousins and we'd get the cows. And then one day he said to my cousin Tom and I, okay, go get the cows. Well, we weren't very old, and the cows were kind of scary. But anyway, he knew we'd be safe, so he would let us go get the cows. But we really sort of participated in the farm, and then came the milk, and the children would deliver the milk, and when you were 16, this was the big deal, you got to drive the pickup truck. So everybody just waited till we were 16, but these kids were hanging off a pickup truck. Some were inside, some were on the running boards. We'd go door to door in Hopkinton. The driver would have the list, and we really made a mistake. And then when I got to be 16, which was a big thrill, but I said to my Uncle Tom, I don't know how to double clutch. And they really taught you anything. He said to me, you'll figure it out. And I was so worried I'd ruin the clutch, but like he said, I did figure it out. But it was like they trusted you to be mature enough to handle situations, which I thought was very valuable early in life. And then my grandmother, I knew her till I was 9 years old. She passed on when I was 9. But it was a very matriarchal society because she was a very strong woman, and she had 5 children. One died.
And what was her first name?
She was a Mary Frances.
Mary Frances.
She was in a lot of Mary Frances. So she had mostly boys, one daughter. The baby was a girl. And I never remember my grandmother ever complaining or, about anything. She was a very, very strong woman. And she didn't, of course, know what feminism was, but she believed in educating women. And her daughter took a trolley to Boston, and she graduated as a teacher from Boston University. And my father and his brother Tom Terry and my father had to work the farm. They were the 2 oldest boys. So they didn't go to education, they couldn't. But my Uncle Francis was younger, so he got educated, and she made sure he graduated from Harvard Law School. So she probably went to the 3rd grade if she got that far, but she was so smart. And as I say, she died when I was 9 years old, and I can remember her talking all about what was going on in Europe and the war coming. I don't know why anybody was surprised by Pearl Harbor, because she kept telling me about it. And she died in 1939, and Pearl Harbor was 41. And I didn't grasp what she was telling me, and I wanted, you know, but I was looking back on that, I realized how involved she was in the world. And she didn't allow any alcohol in her house, ever, ever. We had a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes only. And one day a priest came to visit, and my Uncle Tom gave him a drink. And she waited till the priest left, and she said, "There will be no alcohol in my home on any occasion." She probably had a family. She grew up in a big family. Maybe there was trouble with alcohol, because the Irish certainly had their problems with it. But she was very much self-educated, aware of what was going on in the world, and very, very, very loved by her family. And I was lucky because I was welcomed in by Anna Pine Terry. She became head of her household in the 8th grade. And the way she learned, her mother was sick, and they took her to the doctor, took her to the hospital in Framingham, and came home and put his arm around Anna and said, "You're now the mother." That's the way she learned how her mother died. And she had lots of younger siblings, a lot of them. But those Pines, I don't know if you understand that, they were just so funny. They had the best humor, and they were very tight-knit. And Anna in the 8th grade brought them up. And she never complained about it. She always had a very outgoing personality, very happy. She had one concern, and that was she never went to high school. But she was the most self-educated, like my grandmother. And I'd go to visit her, and she would have the opera on, and she would be reading about an opera. And she could just, she loved that this became an art. I don't know about the rest of them, but she would love that she knew that barn became an art center, because she loved the arts. So that was most of my big memories of the farm. They were...
So that's in probably in the 40s you're talking about?
Yes.
Just to put it into...
My grandmother died in 39, so I was 9 when she died. And I remember people saying there were only 2 times my Uncle Tom cried when the last cow left the farm. He kept them long. He wasn't even in the milk industry then. He had gone on probably to oil. Coal. They went from coal into oil. And he cried when the last cow left the farm. And he cried when his mother was buried. Otherwise, he was a wonderful person. They always let you be what you wanted to be, you know, because they were Democrats, and he used to say to me, "I should be a Republican. I'm in business, and I'd be better off." But he was very, very involved with politics, and he was on the Democratic side. So when I was in college, I was 21. He had to be 21 to vote, so I registered as a Republican because I liked Stevenson. And he didn't say anything for a while, and then he finally said, "You were the first Terry to register as Republican." And that's all he said to me. He wasn't critical, because they always encourage you to be what you wanted to be. And very, very self-reliant, because they had to be, and they encouraged that. And I did appreciate that. But I want to talk a little bit about growing up or raising children. I only moved a street away up to Grove Street, and I had a piece of the Terry hayfield. I remember cows grazing there. And people, when you ride by my house, you don't realize there's, I think, 3 or 4 acres out there still. Probably be developed someday. So my cousin Bill was on the corner, and my cousin Tom was next to him, and I was next to Bill. So we grew up very, very close there. And my children, they kid about it now that no one ever got inside a house. Everything was outside. And when you were 3 years old, you could go up with the children. But there were always a bunch of children and at least one bad dog. So we didn't need I'll say. And the bad dog was usually the Lavoie's dog. He'd be very protective. And so Prince, his name, he didn't like anyone to hug him around the neck. So Kimmy was telling my youngest daughter, 4 children, my youngest said, oh, I remember Prince, I went to hug him and he bit me in the head. And he left marks in her head. And they just looked at her and said, he doesn't like to be bitten in the head, don't hug him anymore. And the dogs were a little, they never hurt the children, but they protected those children because they had to be molesters then. Those children were alone. They were very unsupervised. When I look at how the situation is today, we roamed around the farm, we roamed around, and I allowed my children to roam. When they were 3 years old, the oldest sibling would take them up the street, and they always played outside. And I think that's why they were thin, because they had a lot of exercise and no processed foods in the house. It was very unusual when I was growing up and going to school to see anybody ever overweight. There may be 1 or 0 in a classroom. So that's a really new thing for us. What else do I want to tell you? When I was little growing up on Pleasant Street, I want to tell this because it's kind of funny. My mother was very preoccupied, as I say, with cleaning her house and cooking. And I was outside. I was about 3 or 4. And my brother was 3 years older. And then we had Jackie McKinnon next door. Now, this must have taken a while. This is to see how unsupervised you were. My job, and it was kind of semi-winter, I had a wool snowsuit on. And my job was to go in the shed and get the kerosene. Their job was to collect all the leaves and pile them against the big garage. There were 5 oil trucks in there. So that took quite a time to create the leaves are way up to the top. And then they set the match. I thought this was awesome. So my mother came running out. The flames were leaping over the garage. But the big investigation wasn't that we were left alone for hours to do this. It was who had the match. Was the big thing.
Does your house on Pleasant Street, is it still there?
Yes.
Because I live on
yes,
Pleasant.
It's
yeah.
still there.
Yeah.
Yes. The garage used to be a house across the street. They moved it, made it into a garage. It's not very tall, but it's very long.
Mm-hmm.
It used to hold all the oil trucks.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they painted. I loved it when it was white, but they painted it some kind of tan.
Mm-hmm.
Not this one, the one before that.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Just want to glance at this. Getting back to my kids. They walked to school, and they did have a cafeteria, because I was trying to say, I don't think you had a cafeteria. They said, yes, we did. We had a cafeteria. And they used to go to the library once a week. And they all had to hold hands while they were on their way to the library, and they could not say a word.
So this was in the 60s then, is that right? Or maybe on...
Let's see, they were born, I got married in 53. Yeah, it would be the 60s.
Yeah.
No talking in the library. But I love the library. I see Linda a lot there, and I say very, very proud of the town. And happy. I know when I was younger, it was like, I went to Regis, and they all came from Wellesley and Brookline and Boston, and they're like, Hopkinton. They never heard of it. But it's a beautiful town. It's still a beautiful town. And I was glad to be part of it.
Can you talk any more about the dairy farm? From what I know, how large was it? How many cows did
they have? I bet they had 12 to 14 cows. And they loved the cows.
And his 2 generations had cows? Is that how it went? Yeah.
I think that's why his mother had the cows too, with the father. Yeah. They had cows. Because I heard a story once a cow died. And this I told my grandmother, grandmother Terry. It was a very tragic thing, because cows were expensive, and they depended on that cow. And my grandfather, who I'd never met him, said, don't worry, Maggie, as long as all the problems are in the barn. Because they lost people. And, yeah, the cows were there forever and ever and ever. And, oh, the milk, when you got to be 16 and drive the pickup truck, that was the great experience of delivering milk. And we all survived. All those kids hung on, and I guess the milk got delivered all right. We didn't get any complaints.
You were going to tell me in the beginning you had a story about something that happened on the farm.
Anna, was it about Anna? Something that happened on the farm. No, I know, I was so glad she was my aunt by marriage, but she was so great. She made the best coffee. All she did was throw coffee in an open pan, no coffee pot. And very, very welcoming person. I don't know what that was.
Okay. I can't remember. There was a detail, but it's slipped my mind too. Can you talk about the schools and going to school?
Oh,
What do you remember when you were a child?
Listen, you all have to remember that you may have had a regional school if it weren't for my Uncle Tom. As I said, he was pulled out of school at 16, but he was self-educated and not shy. He was a very eloquent speaker at town meeting. The town was all ready to go for regional high school. And he usually could sway that town meeting. And he got up and gave a wonderful speech. And he ended with, if you let your school is the heart of your community, do not let it go. And they voted to keep the school in town. So be thankful to Tom Terry that you have such a good educational system and control of it. But I know that he'd be so proud, because they all believe in education, that the school is there. Oh, and the frog pond is so little when I walk by it. We thought that was the biggest thing behind the farm. We played there all the time. And I think it's that little fenced or walled-in thing. It was wetlands, so they couldn't get rid of it.
That's now right behind Hopkins School currently?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it's down. I went down there once just to see it, and I couldn't recognize it because it was so little. Because in my child's eye, it was huge.
Yeah.
Huge. So.
And do you remember about classes and what your teachers were like? And
yes, I do. They hit us. They hit us, but I didn't get hit. I think I was very shy. They were, I think, extremely dedicated, and they would tell your parents if you did anything wrong. So, and you would never, the teacher was right all the time. But they had this little, I think called the rattan, they would hit your hands. And in high school, I went to the one on Main Street. Our hours were 8 to 1 p.m. There was no cafeteria, we went home for lunch, and I loved that. I personally think kids are, I know they have to learn more than I did, but it seems like too long a day. I think they should have time to have more freedom and be outside. But I remember my English teacher, and we read, I loved it at the time, we read Shakespeare every year for 4 years. But when I went to college, I was way behind in creative writing and things that these other kids learned. But I loved the hours. It was very personal. Everybody knew one another. Very close-knit community. And, you know, as I say, if you did anything wrong, like we had a hand signal, your father would know about it and you would get spoken to. Anything else?
Do you remember businesses downtown?
When I was very little, my mother used to take me in a men's shop. I remember there was all kinds of men's suits, and there was a shoe shop. And I heard the stories how my ancestors came over in 1840s in the potato famine. And they lived in Boston, and they took a trolley to Hopkinton. And there were 7 shoe factories, which eventually all burned down. And I never quite got the connection what happened to those two, where they landed. I think one of them was landed on the farm someplace, because coming to Hopkinton, he probably realized.
Do you know their names? So they're Terrys.
The Terrys,
Yeah.
yeah, the Terrys. There's always a William. William and Thomas were the big names, and they were always passed down. Francis. So my grandmother was Mary Francis. So her son was a Francis. Her daughter was renamed Mary Francis. So, but William and Thomas were the big names, and they repeated them over and over again. So, yeah, and my grandfather, who died in his 40s, we had no Catholic church, and of course the Irish were very religious, so he used to walk to Worcester every other Sunday. I think he'd leave on Saturday, come back on Sunday. He walked 16 to 18 miles to Worcester, not just to go to church, but he did make church there. It was one of his things he wanted to do, I think, but he had relatives there that he visited. And so they were very much about religion and church, and I remember my parents telling me that when they were building that big church in Hopkinton, my grandparents would save enough money just to eat, for the necessities, and everything they made would go into the church fund to build a church.
To St. John's,
Yes.
to build St. John's.
Yeah, one of the priests sold some of the pews to a bar room in New Hampshire. My father was he was one of the babies of the family. He was always happy, laid back, never get upset. He was so upset that those pews were sold because it meant a lot of us to his family. So,
And how about, do you remember town celebrations?
we had always a big 4th of July parade. It was so much fun, and the McIntyres were in charge, and I think Tommy McIntyre is still in charge.
Of the Horribles then, huh?
The Horribles, yes. And we got all dressed up. Bobby LaVoy was like the center of that for the neighborhood, and he always was big in making the clothes. It was a lot of fun. In other stores in town, we had a Woods. It was like a grocery store, and it was attached to what's now the drugstore. What else we had? I remember the kids had, maybe it became the drugstore. They used to go down and get ice cream. Not a lot of stores. There was a little restaurant that came along, but not a lot of stores that I recall.
Did you go swimming, and did you go to Lake Whitehall and swim?
No.
No?
Maspinock.
Oh,
All
Maspinock.
the time.
Okay.
Yeah,
That
it
must have
was
been
fun.
great.
It was fun.
Yeah.
Yes, but it was hard because my mother and father couldn't swim, so they made us stay close to shore. That generation, a lot of them never learned to swim.
I've had people talk about bonfires. Do you remember bonfires?
Huge, yes, they used to
Yeah.
get them every 4th of July. It was a huge celebration. I think when you have a rural community, you put a lot of effort into things like that. You have the time probably to do
Yeah.
it. It was a nice town. I loved growing up in it, and I still love it.
Well, I think you did a nice job. I know that when we put this off, you're going to remember other stories, though,
Probably.
family stories. So you're Irish on both sides? That's what you're...
I am 1/4 Yankee English from the Palmers on my mother's side. My mother's father was from Maine, Pembroke, and I think he was 100% Yankee. So,
But otherwise, yeah.
3/4 Irish.
Yeah, and the first Irish came and worked in the boot factories. Do you
Shoe
think?
factories,
Yeah.
Boston. They lived in Boston, worked out here. Imagine having 7 shoe factories in Hopkinton.
Yeah, yeah. Does it look dramatically different now? You see, I mean, what you see?
Oh, yes. It's very hard for the townies, I think, to accept the buildings because we're used to a lot of trees and rural spaces
And farms. There were. Do you remember other farms?
Yes, there are. Like my daughter, Elizabeth, she's works at Tufts and she's very involved in horses.
Mm-hmm.
and there are very few farms left.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just about I don't know how many horse farms are left. Not
Mhm.
many, because the one that she works on is closing. So that's going. But she has built a house out in the Berkshires. We can't see any houses.
Yeah, yeah.
She wants to live out there someday, I'm sure.
So she's looking for a more rural
Mm-hmm.
setup situation.
Isn't any work. But she'd lived there full time. She loves it, loves the people.
Yeah.
This like Hopkinton used to be 1,200 in the town.
Someone else talked about that, how they're relocating little at a time to Maine, and the Maine where they are in Maine, they spend their summers, but it reminds them of what Hopkinton was like in the 50s.
Very rural.
Yeah, trying to go get back to that.
And the coyotes come in the yard up there, and she's near a state forest. It's called Bear Mountain, because there's a lot of bears. And she was sitting on her front porch, and the dog runs out. She's chasing a baby bear, of all things. And she
Wow.
knew Mummy would come. And Mummy did come. And Mummy bear put the baby up the tree, and the dog is going crazy to get both of them. And Beth is going crazy to get the dog. And then the bear was crouching and trying to scare the dog off. They don't want to hurt you. She just wanted her baby back. And finally, after a long time, Beth finally got a hold of the dog. And Mommy bear motioned, and the baby bear, a little teeny thing, came running down. And then as she was leaving, she turned around and stared at Beth, and Beth said to her, "I'm very sorry." But they don't want to hurt.
Yeah.
Beth thought with the baby bear there'd be a lot more trouble.
Yeah, yeah,
But they love their bears out there. They really respect them.
yeah. Well, here in the town, it was more open than it is now, isn't it? Hasn't it kind of, other than the houses? Of course, there's a lot of new houses, but a lot of what used to be fields are now have trees. You know, behind my house is where
So that's nice.
I know, there's a lot of what the Terry property was, and what used to be fields are now kind of new forest, new woodland.
So that's good.
Yeah, and there's a lot of animals back there.
So that's good.
Until they develop back there, but yeah.
Hopefully for a while.
I know. All right, well, it's been very nice talking with you. Anything else that you would like to say, Irene?
That can bring to mind. I'll probably think of something later, but I'm glad to participate. And I want to acknowledge the library, because I go there a lot, and the people are so wonderful and helpful and do a great job.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very important part of the town.
Yeah.
Especially years ago when people
Yeah.
buy books.
Yeah. Yeah, it's 100, and that building is 120 years old this year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you. So this concludes the interview with Irene Timlege, who grew up in the town, and today is February 23rd, 2015, and we're in the middle of some really severe weather. Do you remember weather like this as a kid? Storms like this?
I remember 78. It was around then. And
Yeah, that was
But they say this surpassed it.
I don't know, we didn't have the
Huge to us
cold
at the
like
time.
that.
We
Yeah.
lost I was on Pleasant Street, we lost one of those great big trees, but it missed our house. But that was a big one.
It was, but it wasn't cold like it's been this month.
This is
It's
terrible.
been really tough, yeah. All right, terrific. Thank you very much for talking with me.
It's a pleasure.